Welcome everyone. My name is Henk Huizer. I'm a senior lecturer curriculum and learning design at QUT, we've decided to do this session a bit different from the usual. Normally we have presentations, as some of you will know. Today we decided to go and have a discussion and a panel discussion in particular. The steering group for the TELedvisors SIG we came together a little while ago, a few weeks ago, and we were just talking about what are some of the issues that are currently affecting all of us, and some of those are quite serious. And so we came up with three main areas for discussion today. One of them is TELedvisors roles and employment changes. So either during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 into the future, because there's a lot been happening in this space in the last few weeks and months, as you all know. So that's kind of from the perspective of the staff. From student perspective, you know, the whole idea of going, putting everything online in a very short space of time has all sorts of impacts. And so we talked specifically about things like accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in online environment, particularly when it comes to people who are not used to designing for online learning, or who are not used to facilitating in an online environment. So all of that affects all students, but some more than others. The other one is, and the other one on the student, from the student perspective, is student equity in a post-COVID context. So yeah, so and so we kind of brought some people together who are specialists in these areas. So we've got Dr. Mel Henry. She's a senior advisor diversity and equity at Curtin University. We've got Dr. Ben Eltham from the NTEU. He's also a lecturer in media and communication at Monash University. And we've got Cathy Easte, who is Manager of Student Disability and Accessibility at Griffith University. And she's joined by Lisa Chiang, who's Senior Disability Advisor at Griffith. So starting with you, Mel, can I ask you to expand a little bit on your role, first of all, and then talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected, in your view, students in terms of diversity and equity, and will do so in the future?
Thanks, Hank. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm really honoured to be here, and I'm so glad that everyone is talking about this. My name's Mel Henry. I am a Senior Advisor of Diversity and Equity at Curtin University over in the West. So my role doesn't necessarily directly deal with students, but rather I work more, excuse me, in the policy and strategy space, and I look after our higher education participation and partnership program funding, which is federal grant funding for targeted activities to support students from low SES backgrounds. So in terms of how COVID has impacted our work, well, the mass move to online obviously has put a lot of things in a different sphere. We've got students that with accessibility needs that have not necessarily benefited. Others have benefited from the move to online. We've also got lots of regional and remote students who've been impacted around internet connectivity and things like that. So that has given us some additional challenges, but not necessarily ones we're unfamiliar with. And also, with COVID more broadly, the impact on students across the board in terms of losing income, losing support network and things like that has actually meant that we've got more students, I guess, falling into our equity categories as well. So over the last few months, we've definitely seen our roles get busier, and going forward, I think it's a little bit of an unknown. WA is in quite a privileged position at the moment in terms of COVID, but we're still looking at a lot of online delivery going forward for the remainder of 2020 and into 2021. So some of those challenges will no doubt persist.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Do you want to go next, Ben?
Sure, happy to. So obviously 2020 has been a year of many ups and downs. It's been a roller coaster in many respects. It's been a challenge for me personally with homeschooling and with my family. As a teacher, rapidly adapting my course to online and dealing with some of the technological challenges like Zoom tutorials and things like that. And of course, from an industrial relations point of view, it's signaled dramatic changes in the higher education sector. So obviously, the most important event that's happened as related to the pandemic has been the closing of international borders and the fact that international students have, in many cases, not been able to enrol in university courses in Australia, and that's had obviously major impacts on the revenues and the bottom lines of universities across Australia. So that's embroiled the university sector in some very, very serious restructuring, cost cutting, and as a union president at a branch of a big university, I've been intimately involved in that. So there have been a number of different responses by various university managements. Some universities have moved straight to forced redundancies, like Deakin. Other universities have opted to negotiate with the union to try and cut costs through things like foregoing pay rises or even in some cases pay cuts to staff in order to stave off forced redundancies. But there's obviously been major disruption and major change across the sector. So it's been a very challenging time. Personally, my response has been to try and save as many jobs as I can at Monash University, and we're very proud as a branch that we were able to negotiate a deal with the university to give up a pay rise and in return to make sure that there were no forced redundancies at Monash University. So that was the negotiation that we were able to enter into, and that was endorsed by our union membership. But at other universities, vice chancellors refused to negotiate, and there's been devastating job losses, such as Deakin, where I mentioned I think 420 jobs have gone, but we're seeing cost cutting really across the sector. So it's a very challenging time for the universities, and that's even before the new reforms, in inverted commas, that have just been announced by Education Minister Dan Tehan, which will have further disruptive effects on university funding and on our higher education sector.
Yes, they will indeed. Thanks, Ben. That's a really good overview. Cathy?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. I manage the Student Disability and Accessibility Service here at Griffith University, and I guess for COVID we've seen just, like has been shared, the rapid change in trying to deliver change to online, which meant we had to change support needs for close to 3,000 students from an on-campus environment to an online environment. And not all the supports were very quick to put in place. Academic staff were still trying to work out how they were going to deliver courses and tutorials and all the rest, and we had to organise captions and all the rest of it for our students with disabilities. So it was a nightmare for a couple of months, but I'm literally grabbing wood at the moment. That's a tiny bit quiet, and we have a little bit of a semblance of where we're going forward, but we still don't know what the next trimester is going to be, because it will be more of a mixed mode for us here at Griffith, in the sense that we will also be having some on-campus classes as well, and how that's going to work for students. We're seeing an increase in needs. We have more students that perhaps didn't have needs before, and now they have needs in the online environment. Students who were previously online finding online more of a challenge because maybe their internet was affected, or they had additional home challenges as well. So it didn't matter how the student was previously studying. I think we've had impacts across the board between online and on-campus students. Just for simple access, they don't have computers or decent computers at home to study online, and as well as our international students who did manage to get here and then get home and then have to still continue studying online. So there's been a whole range of issues and a whole lot of unknowns. We also here at Griffith coordinate sign language interpreting for a lot of the southeast Queensland region and TAFEs as well. So that was also an additional challenge to try and organise sign language interpreting for a number of platforms, whether it be Teams, Collaborate, Zoom, Skype, FaceTime sort of thing, to enable students to access class material. So it certainly was a period of extreme high activity and lots of additional hours, which we were suddenly told we weren't allowed to claim any additional hours or do any flex hours. So yeah, as a manager, it's certainly been very challenging. Yeah, there's been an increase in counselling sort of support as well, and that's the other reason why I asked Lisa to join us, because Lisa works across 2 teams here at Griffith. She does a lot of the mental health and counselling as well as the disability support. So she works in the 2 teams, and she's also works with a lot of our academic and learning and teaching advisors in terms of accessibility and so forth. So that's it.
Okay, thanks all. I should say as well that the chat is open for questions as we go along, so please feel free to post questions in there. We've got a Padlet open, and the link has been posted in the chat as well, so there's questions from there. Just as an initial question, and I think this probably applies to all of you, and it's in response to something that you said, Cathy, the issue around workload. So how do you think that impacts on specifically people who work with like TELedvisors, like people who work with academic staff, and how does it then impact on students?
Yeah, the workload is was a real one. Like, I think I've worked in this sector for a long time, and we were already overworked. Okay, we're already overworked and so forth. So to have all of this additional work, because we had to redo everything we've already done and already had in place, and had to redo the whole lot in such a short space of time, and not to be able to claim additional hours for that workload, I found it offensive, and I found it really difficult as a manager to support my team through that, and continually say, well, you know, it's okay, there's always tomorrow, we'll work it out, that sort of thing. But, you know, I've managed a degree of flexibility with my team, and I'm sure they feel supported enough that, you know, they've been able to manage that. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to juggle. workloads and not being able to claim for the workload that you do. Like, yeah, when you've already put in hundreds of hours that you don't claim, and then to have to do that again and work very, very long hours. It's, yeah, it was very tiring. And next week's my first opportunity to have a week off, and I am doing absolutely nothing.
That's good. I was going to bring in Ben here as well. Are you there, Ben?
Sorry, I've muted myself there. So I think workload is a problem across our sector, and the nature of our sector means that you know, it's full of passionate people who actually want to teach, and they want their students to have the very best experience. So I think, unfortunately, it's kind of natural for teachers and academics to go the extra mile and to do extra work, even just in a normal kind of higher education setting. And then if you add a crisis scenario into that, as we've seen this year, then it's not surprising that there's been a very large amount of overwork that's become, you know, part of the system. You know, at Monash, we saw really the whole university go online within about 2 weeks. So staff really moved mountains to I think, to achieve some extraordinary pedagogical outcomes in a very, very short turnaround indeed. And at least at Monash anyway, we think that, you know, given all of the disruptions, that the students have had a pretty good experience. Of course, it's not the same as real teaching in a classroom, but given the constraints, I think we've done very, very well. The problems of people struggling with overwork is endemic to higher education. It's something that's very difficult to combat as the union, because many of our members want to do it. They want to work because they want to teach, they believe in what they're doing, and they're passionate about their students. But we are aware that across the sector, the NTEU thinks that the average academic works about 50 hours a week. Now at Monash, you're paid for 36.5 hours a week. So the average academic at Monash is doing nearly 2 whole days free work for the university every week. So that shows the scale of the problem. There's no easy solution to it. The only thing what we can do is to continue to organise and to continue to recruit members to try and be as strong as possible in the workplace, so that we can bargain with the university to try and reduce those workloads. But it's very difficult.
So do you see, how do you see that going into the future, like in the longer term? Because you know, it's, for some people, it's really kind of not sustainable.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think it is. I think it's very difficult, particularly for you know, parents and carers, people with responsibilities at home. It's very difficult. I think the future is going to contain an awful lot of industrial unrest. Actually, I think our sector's heading for significant conflict between workers and management, because the situation is at breaking point for many people. But we should also be cognizant of the fact that there is, as I said, no easy solution. You know, in order to try and push back on workloads which are constantly being overlaid by management, that's very difficult. That requires you know, staff to be extremely organised and to be brave, you know, to stand up to management. So it's difficult, and I think there's likely to be significant workplace conflict in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just gonna change tack a little bit and show the Padlet. And I'm specifically wanting to focus on the bit on the right there. So about institutional policies. And I want to bring in Mel into this at the moment, at this stage. So there's a question there about whether institutional policies are sufficient to cover online remote learning. And is there even an expectation that we're still adhering to those policies, given the emergency nature of the COVID response? And so, yeah, so there's a question, Mel, around, you know, the quick move online and what the impact for that is, particularly when we're looking at equity groups.
Yep. I think, well, yes, there was a very, very quick move to online, and a lot of those efforts were focused on getting our teaching materials up onto platforms as soon as possible. There was a huge demand for our learning designers to help get that material up. And all of this basically has culminated in lots of online materials, but not necessarily programs designed for online learning. So I guess we've had not necessarily a standard model of online education happening in the last few months. We've had an interim version, so that we have some courses that have been teaching online for many years and they've done extremely well in this environment, and others that have had a rapid shift, and yes, so it hasn't been quite so optimal, which has also meant that our policies around things like accessibility have kind of fallen a bit by the wayside. So not necessarily following how we would do standard online learning, just get it done as quickly as possible. But also we've had all of our support programs, our services have also largely moved online, and that we don't have a lot of policy around that. And that has been quite a challenge for many of us. We're having to work with students in entirely new formats. You know, how do we have a private conversation with a student? Do we have a phone call if we would normally meet with them in an office? Do we have a web call? Do we use which platform? So there's really been so much change so quickly that there isn't a standard way of operating anymore. So I guess to answer your question around, you know, do our policies really, you know, are they fit for purpose in this climate and going forward? No, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around quality assurance of our teaching and learning in the online space, but also around all the other work that we do, how we engage students, and in setting up your infrastructure and protocols for how we work with students beyond the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This relates. It relates to. Let me just share this Padlet again. Yeah. So there's. It relates to resources as well. And I was going to bring you in again, Ben, at that point, because it says here many subjects that were traditionally lecture format are moving fully online without any change, not only to the delivery style or pedagogical style, but no change in to staff resourcing. So is there anything, I suppose the question is there anything we can do to address that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So I agree. In many cases, the online courses are having the same kind of resources or even less resourcing than they were in a face-to-face context, and therefore teachers are being asked to pick up the slack there. And I think anyone who's done a fair bit of online teaching this year will agree with me that it's quite tiring online teaching. I find it quite exhausting because it's a different kind of energy than being in the room with students. you know, there's an element of acting there where you're kind of constantly looking at your face all day while you're trying to modulate your own facial expressions, check in on your other students in the classroom, in the virtual classroom. You know, I find it difficult because some students will just hide behind a black screen. You don't know whether they're engaging or not. So there's a lot of challenges to digital pedagogy. And often the way that we've tried to respond to the crisis is simply to throw courses up onto the Moodle or the online teaching resource and just hope that it works. I think for some students it's been positive because some students seem to really thrive in the digital environment, but for other students they become very disengaged, and there's a real student welfare issue, I think, with the new normal, the new paradigm. I don't have a lot of hopes for securing more resourcing for teaching in the current federal policy environment. The recent announcements from Minister Tian are very pessimistic, I think, particularly for certain disciplines that seem to be slated for funding cuts from the federal government. So we face an incredibly challenging situation, and I think it's unfortunately it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Okay, I was going to bring in Cathy there, because a lot of the you know, the pedagogical change, like the skills to you know, to teach online basically, have an impact, or the lack of those skills have an impact on accessibility and diversity and inclusion. So it has a particular impact on some students. You know, for example, if someone teaches online in Zoom, or someone requires fast typers as part of the engagement. So what are your thoughts on equipping, I guess, or capacity building of teaching staff to deal with this or to make it more accessible?
It would be nice if the whole world stopped and we had a few weeks to work with staff before anybody had to do anything, but that didn't happen. So, like, I take my hat off to, you know, what the academic staff have been able to achieve in putting information online. And yeah, not everything is perfect and not everything is accessible, but I also take my hats off to the many institutions who have gone out of their way to do something more. Right, and that means, like, they've incorporated ASR across the board for all of their lectures or online materials, which is automatic speech recognition, captioning or transcription, etc., at an additional cost or whatever. So that provides some immediacy of access. And yeah, those sort of accesses are not perfect, but the immediacy of access for students, that really helped. So, you know, everybody has done a fantastic job, but then there's so many different platforms, and I have some teachers who are teaching in one class in Zoom and the next class they're teaching Collaborate because that's what the school has learned. So they've had to learn multiple systems, and I think, you know, that, as well as, you know, my team have had to support those multiple systems. So it's not just like you're standing in front of a room delivering a lecture anymore and using the microphones in front of a lecture theatre or something, and whatever system your school has is recording that lecture. You suddenly have to learn a whole lot of different systems, and that has been difficult. What we have done is try to embed some of our staff into the teaching and learning discussion environments within the institute. So we can, when they talk about using different platforms, we can feed information into that on how to make it accessible. In this environment, that's probably the best thing we've been able to do in a short space of time. Going forward, we're trying to make a whole lot of short videos, and all right, if you're going to teach using collaborate, this is what you have to remember to make it accessible. So we're pulling together as many simple resources that perhaps don't exist, or pulling the ones that do exist and trying to make them more readily accessible for staff. Yeah, and I think the biggest positive for me as a practitioner and as a manager of this service has been the number of queries from academics that go, oh, my course is not accessible, and it probably hasn't been accessible all the way through. Now I want to make it accessible. So as Ben alluded to before, the passion of people that work in this environment is really, really evident, and they do want to do the right thing, but it's having the right amount of time and resources and staffing to do that. It's always going to be the challenge.
Okay, thank you. Wendy, Jenny, Colin, are there any questions in the chat at this point?
There's been a few questions, but we've probably been answering them as we go, or discussing them as we go. I think, I think Jenny mentions these resources are fantastic. I mean, I think really probably there's a few things around, I guess, like easy tips. It sounds like workload is an issue, and so ways that we can all do improve the student experience and student equity and accessibility in, I guess, good bang for buck ways. I hate to use that term, but I'm just thinking, yeah, because there's always going to be, I mean, I think, ultimately there's lots of things we should be doing, but if you have to kind of pick if there are low-hanging fruit that we should be really prioritizing, like I tend to try and deal with, say, image alt tags, because they're really easy and quick to kind of fix. There are other things that are, or trying to get automatic captions on, and having tools that do that. So I guess if other people have ideas around that, that would be really useful, because at the end of the day, if we're trying to support staff and improve that for everybody, it's, I guess, trying to pick the things that are maybe going to be likely to be taken up and achievable in, realistic timeframes and workloads.
Yeah, that's cool. I was going to bring in Mel at this point and ask, because Kate was just talking about, low-hanging fruit and what is some of the things that we as TELedvisors can do. And related to that is a question of, like, are some equity groups more impacted by this than others, and should we focus on, like, which group should we be focusing on as a priority in the short term, and maybe into the future?
Yep. I think if there is one benefit to all of this change, it has been that there's actually been quite a bright light shone on the work of our learning designers and the value that you can really provide to the design of courses for the online environment in particular, and for accessibility, and the role and the expertise that we can also draw in from those equity and diversity professionals. So that's been really good over the last little while. It would be, I guess, it should be easier to go into the future with that knowledge and remembering that knowledge. And I do see that as a low-hanging fruit, in that we've already worked closely with these areas. So if we can continue working closely with them and continue to have in mind those challenges that students from equity groups might be facing, then that will automatically mean that we're ticking things off when we're developing new courses. We're actually remembering to check the accessibility and things like that. But also there are enterprise-wide solutions for many of these accessibility issues. So for instance, Curtin has just done a pilot with Blackboard Ally, which provides captioning, automatic captioning for things that happen within the Blackboard environment, including Collaborate. and that has facilitated a lot of accessibility. And having the option there is very easy for people to then turn it on. If it's an individually led initiative, then it's very hit and miss, and we just get the odd person that's really committed to this space turning those things on, or purchasing software that can do that, which isn't obviously as widespread. Also, I mean, I would think rather than necessarily picking one group to support over another, my advice would be to always be open to student feedback and to invite student feedback, to be mindful of how students are responding to content and to activities. If there's students who aren't engaging, find out why. And we've got services that are available to help with individual arrangements where that's necessary, but in many cases they are quick fixes that are needed. But having that student voice is actually the easiest way to find out what students need.
So reaching out to students, who would be the best person to do that, do you think? Like, is that?
Well, I think that's, I guess, your academics role. When you're working with your students, learn about them, find out who they are and what challenges they face. And then behind the scenes, there's many people that can support those academics. So once you learn that information, you can then pass it on and you access the support that is also available to you as an academic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a question here about remote online proctoring, and I was going to ask you, Cathy, about this, because it talks about how that affects some students in terms of their home environment and where they would be doing exams potentially. I guess it doesn't just apply to exams either. It applies to online learning full stop, I suppose.
It does apply to all learning. I guess we started with some online proctoring before COVID. We've been using it for all of 2019 for some courses. So for some Griffith stuff, though, it was very, very new. But we were used to it. We tested out the accessibility of the online proctoring that we use, etc. So I wasn't necessarily concerned with the online proctoring. It's been interesting to see the student response once it's rolled out more generally. There has been student responses that they're not comfortable with someone watching them via a computer, whereas they're more comfortable sitting in a room with someone watching them, even if they're sitting in a room on their own, which is the case. And and then we've had a number of other students who find the online proctoring so much more comfortable than doing their exams on campus, and they actually want to continue doing their exams that way. So it's a pretty mixed bag. I don't think students with disabilities have actually disliked using the online proctoring any more than any other student group. And in some cases we've received just fantastic praise on how much more accessible it is. There are still some concerns because you have to be very, very clear on the access that your student needs. So if you have a student that uses assistive software, then you have to be very clear on the access to that. So some students cannot set up the online proctoring without additional help. So if you've got a blind student, they cannot use their webcam to show the whole room as easily as somebody who's not blind. So therefore they may need assistance in doing that, and having all of these things really outlined to your online proctoring agency is really critical. But I guess we had a bit of prior experience, so we were able to make that really, really clear on our end.
Okay, just as a follow-up question to that, in terms of how students deal with with particular technologies, or if there's any, are there any specific technologies that in the first semester you are aware of that have been really, really useful, that have been kind of like success stories? And equally, have there been ones that you thought might work and haven't?
Okay, I guess from my perspective, the technologies that work, especially in this environment, are the technologies that we have available to all students anyway. So the Microsoft Suite, Microsoft Word, you can dictate, you can translate it into other languages. So if you're a slow typer, you can use Microsoft Word to dictate. All of those things that are built in to the Microsoft Suite, I found a lot more accessible, and students were able to engage them because they can download Microsoft from our Griffith website and they have access to that immediately. It's the other technologies where students are dependent on the more costly technology, say for read and write gold, whereas they then had to download that onto their home device. It hasn't necessarily been a simple step, and we've had to, you know, set up certain procedures for that. We have made it available and accessible, but it just took a bit of time to get to that point, and therefore the immediacy of access, and that's what I come back to in a lot of the support. If you can access something immediately, then you're studying more on the same basis as other students. So, and the Microsoft, a lot of the Microsoft Suite allows us to do that. So that's been the most beneficial, I think.
Okay, that's really, yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. Are there any questions in the chat at this point?
If I could just jump in there.
Yeah, no, you do.
Yeah. I'd like to nominate the Humble podcast as a bit of a killer technology. I taught 2 subjects this semester, and for both of them, I recorded a podcast with one of my teaching colleagues. And I found it really good for a lot of the students for the asynchronous learning. So they could listen to it on their phones, they could listen to it at home doing the dishes. And also because it was more, we tried to record them more as conversations and less as kind of lectures. So some of the students found that they were really accessible. You know, they were able to sort of, they found them more conversational and enjoyable to get their head around the content in that kind of format rather than in a kind of traditional standing in front of a PowerPoint kind of lecture. So I personally found the podcast to be a really useful one.
Cool. That's cool. I was just going to ask you that there have been quite a few questions been around the role, about roles, position changes during during the last few months, and this is something that is quite common to TELedvisors anyway. There's quite a lot of scope creep, so to speak, around role descriptions and what it includes and what it doesn't include. What would be some of your advice into the future about dealing with that? Like how should TELedvisors position themselves to kind of, I guess, protect themselves a little bit around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have an open dialogue with your management, and I think you need to be, if your role is substantially changing, then that's a change arguably to the position description of your job. So you do need to be open with your supervisor about that if it's happening, and particularly if you're sort of ending up doing an awful lot of work that perhaps you're not being paid for or that you would not normally be doing. I think that's an industrial issue, and that's something that you could bring up with your union representative if you're a union member. Again, though, these things need to be done carefully and sensitively to make sure that that you're not running into trouble, that you're not getting yourself into hot water. Yeah, it should be done ideally in consultation with the union, that kind of stuff. But it's certainly something that you should take notes about, and that you should keep a close eye on. Even a diary perhaps of your duties or the hours that you're putting into particular tasks, so you can document how things are changing and what the new responsibilities that you're being asked to fulfill are.
Because in relation to what we were talking about earlier, it's a lot of it relates to actual staff development as well, like professional
That's
development.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to bring Mel into the conversation and ask you, Mel, in your view, what are the main risks of a post-COVID context for student equity, and how do you think we could address some of those risks or prepare for them?
I think there's particular risks in the context of COVID for vulnerable populations who perhaps aren't able to come back onto campus as quick as other students. And in this, we've all managed to shift to the new normal of online, but shifting back is actually going to be quite different. We'll have some people participating online, some people not participating online. And I'm sure we can all remember the example of people tuning into webcasts in the old days and asking a question and nobody ever noticed they were there. So that is going to be a challenge going forward as well if we're going to have blended participation. So keeping those students in mind. Also, really the elephant in the room, the higher education reforms, they are there because of COVID, although certain elements may have been pre-thought of, and that will really have an impact on our equity cohorts. The areas of study that are going to be cheaper will entice more students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds into those areas, which are also happen to be lower paying jobs and fewer jobs available. So we're really going to perpetuate inequities in society along those lines. But that's all still subject to change, so I won't panic too much at this stage. But yeah, I think it's really, there's so many unknowns about the future. My real concern is that we forget what we've learnt during this time and go back to focusing on what many of us in our privileged situation have experienced, which was the nice flexibility of working from home, and now we're back in the office and we can see our friends. So not forgetting about those people that haven't been able to return back to the office as yet, and the ongoing barriers really that we've had a window into, but many students will continue to face into the future.
Thank you. I think we've pretty much covered what was in the Padlet, and thanks everyone for adding their comments and questions into the Padlet. Are there any questions in the chat that we haven't discussed yet? No. Okay. Okay. We'll do some final. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think we're okay.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. So we'll do a final, some concluding comments from each of the panelists. So if I can, I'll start with Cathy. Some final thoughts for today.
I guess the only final thoughts I have is that most academics and most learning and teaching advisors have an understanding of accessibility to a point, and you're probably doing everything okay. But just check in with the disability officers if you can, and keep doing what you're doing. You know, you are working really hard and you are being inclusive. And if you can put some voice to the requests that come through the disability office for, you know, across the institution-wide use of ASR or things like that within your institutions, then you're supporting many of your students, because if you had ASR transcripts available for all your lecture recordings, those ASR transcripts can be copied and then put into MS Word and translated into languages other than English for all of your international students. They can be read aloud with assistive technology and other technologies. They enable our students to do so much more. So access isn't just about students with disabilities. It is that whole equity spectrum that benefits from all of what we do under the banner of disability.
Cool. Thanks, Cathy. Mel, some final thoughts?
Firstly, I actually want to thank and congratulate all of you, because I recognise the enormous amount of work that has happened over the last few months, and it's not work that you haven't done previously. It's I guess it's just ramped up for you even more, and I hope that doesn't continue to happen. But I guess my layperson feedback on that is to use the highlight that you've been given to actually demand more recognition for this work, because we cannot continue in a post-COVID world without valuing the work of TELedvisors. And I guess in terms of accessibility and inclusive design going forward, my advice to everyone is usually just to check your assumptions. You know, just constantly question, you know, would this work for somebody that has a hearing impairment, has a vision impairment, someone who has problematic internet connections, somebody who is English as a second language? Just do a bit of a check, and then use the people in your diversity and equity areas of your university, because we are here to help. Although, yes, we're busy, but we've always got time for people who are going to help make our universities more inclusive. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Mel. That's great. Ben, some final thoughts from you?
Yeah, well, I'd like to echo those sentiments. I'd like to congratulate everyone for all the hard work that we've all been doing over the last 4 or 5 months to try and bring bring education to as many students as possible. You know, coronavirus is reordering the political and the economic priorities of our society and of our world, and I think we actually stand at a very interesting point in contemporary history. I'm going to post a link here on the chat to a blog post that I really like from a political economist called William Davies. He talks about how COVID is a holiday for exchange value. And what he's talking about there is that it's kind of reordering the way in which we think about the economy, the way in which we exchange goods and services in our entire society. And I think it's a marvelous moment to reflect on the importance of the work that we do as teachers and educators. You know, at the same time as we have a hostile federal government that's trying to reduce and diminish the value of education, of the arts, of the humanities, of the ABC in our society, we also have this inspirational example of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who really are essential workers, still getting on with the job and coming up with solutions to very difficult problems. So I'd say to everyone here, give yourselves a pat on the back and remind yourself that the work that you're doing is vital in the new world that we're entering into.
Cool. Thank you. And while we're giving people pats on backs, can we all say a big thank you to Ben and Mel and Cathy and Lisa, who's being there in the background as well. Thanks very much. I think it's been a really good session. Yeah, so thanks again. Hopefully,
Thanks, Hank.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Right. See you all.
Thank you.